Russia is in global retreat. So in this video, I want to explore some of the indications about how big that retreat is going forward into the coming days, weeks, and months, and maybe even years. So we have seen the dramatic scenes in Syria. The Russian-backed Assad regime collapsed within the space of about 2 weeks from when the rebels launched their offensive on Aleppo. Suddenly, 2 weeks later, they are in the capital, Damascus, and Russia was able to do very little, or was willing to do very little, to prop up their ally Assad. He has fled now with his family to Russia, and there were lots of videos coming out of Syria showing Russian troops basically been allowed to transit safely to where they have a military and airfield in the west of Syria, presumably to be evacuated out of the country. So what does all this mean, and what other indicators are we going to see in the short to medium term that will allow us to gauge how big this retreat in power projection by Russia really is? That's what I'm going to look at in this video. Firstly, Привit, my name is Connor Klein. I'm an expert in international relations. Been living in Ukraine for many years, speak both Ukrainian and Russian, so I'm here to give you a more informed, nuanced, and unique perspective on the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war and the geopolitical events that shape it. For example, what has been happening in Syria. Now, the first big indicator we're going to get is what actually happens in Syria. Will the Russians actually be able to negotiate with the new government, maybe to even keep those bases? That would obviously be an indicator that it's not as big a decline in their ability to project their power outside their borders. Also, those military facilities in Syria were useful to Russia not only to project its power in the Middle East, but also onwards in Africa, where they have many interests in West and Central Africa, also in North Africa, like Sudan, Libya. Then you've got like Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, countries like that, which were under the influence of French-backed regimes in the past that have flipped a lot in the last few years. So we will see in the coming, say, year or so whether those regimes that are in power, those governments, they stay in power or they stay backed by Russia, or we're going to see all that progress from Russia's point of view reversed. That obviously allows Russia to get access to a lot of resources in Africa. Africa has a resource curse as a continent, so mired in poverty, a lot of it, but they have a lot of resources that can be extracted and that have been quite useful and lucrative to Russia. So that's going to be the big indicator after Syria itself, is going to be Russia's ability to project its power onto the continent of Africa. However, there are other indicators a lot closer to Russia's borders that are going to give us a big clue about Russia's state of its ability to be a regional and global power going forward. Firstly, let's look at Moldova. Recently, they had elections. Russia basically had a pro-Russian candidate, we'll say, or they were backing a pro-Russian candidate in the country. Kind of makes sense because he would have basically helped with Moldova perhaps even flipping and not continuing on its path to EU accession. However, in the referendum on enshrining an article into the Moldovan constitution about the reversible path, basically, of EU membership for Moldova, that won. It won very narrowly. It was 50.5% to 49.5%. So basically, we'll say as an influence campaign that Russia ran, obviously would have been in their interest for that to have been defeated. They narrowly failed in that attempt. And then in the presidential election, the second round that followed, the incumbent and pro-EU candidate, Maya Sandu, she won reasonably comfortably in the end with 10 percentage points, 55% to 45% against a pro-Russian candidate. So they failed in that extent in Moldova to perhaps create a massive problem for Ukraine. And obviously, if you had a pro-Russian government on the border with Ukraine, another one, if you see that maybe Viktor Orban and Fico in Slovakia are seen as maybe not completely pro-Russian, but they are definitely more favorable to Russia than, say, the Polish government is, and the Baltic states and other governments in the European Union, and those countries border Ukraine. The other country that borders Ukraine is Romania. They also had elections, or they were supposed to have elections, and those elections were cancelled for the presidency with allegations of illegal election funding basically by Russia. I think they just said a state actor and non-state actors, but no one thinks it's really anybody other than Russia, maybe China because they own TikTok. And you had Kalin Georgescu, who was ahead in the polls. He came in first place in the first round of the presidential elections. It was a huge surprise. His statements were incredibly favorable to the Kremlin. He said that if he had become president, or if he does become president, I guess, when these presidential elections finally take place, that he would stop all military aid to Ukraine, stop Ukraine exporting its grain outside of Ukraine through the Romanian Black Sea ports, and many other policies that were incredibly pro-Russian and very surprising because of Romania's history with Russia. Historically, they have not been very friendly with each other, so a big surprise that a kind of populist nationalist figure like Georgescu would have such a pro-Russian slant. But in any case, whether it turns out as expected that Russia was illegally involved in his election campaign, I say that it's more probably obvious if you look at my channel, very small channel. I was inundated with comments under the videos about Romania and the elections with very odd trolling and probably AI-generated bot comments with a line with very specific language about Georgescu. So definitely there was some organized campaign. Whether that turns out to have been illegal or not, I guess it's up to the courts in Romania. But definitely Russia's hopes to have a pro-Russian candidate in Romania have also failed recently. Again, back to Moldova, we've got the pro-Russian separatist Republic of Transnistria. It is de facto independent. It is not recognized internationally as legally being independent. It is not de jure. It's not even actually recognized as independent by Russia, oddly enough. And they have a peculiar situation because they were very dependent on Russian gas that has been transiting through Ukraine, even with this Russo-Ukrainian war, even with the extended invasion of 2022, there is still gas going there to Transnistria. That is due to end at the end of this year. So on January 1st, 2025, there will be no more gas transiting through Ukraine to Transnistria. Transnistria already is in a dire economic situation. They have a GDP per capita that's only 1/3 of the rest of Moldova. And basically the gas is hugely important to their struggling economy. So they will be in a massive economic crisis come January 1st. They've already introduced some sort of emergency situation with respect to their economic crisis that they are facing. So that is going to be a big problem for Russia's power projection because they actually have 1,500 troops officially there as peacekeepers in Transnistria. However, what are the Transnistrians going to do if Russia is no longer able to subsidize their economy? We could see a big shift in their position. So we have to see what happens in the new year, whether Transnistria will even want to stay kind of pro-Russian in that sense, or whether it will seek some sort of rapprochement with Chisinau, the capital, and the central authorities there. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with those 1,500 Russian peacekeepers, because they already agreed to leave many, many years ago, and they never did. Another country a little bit further away is Georgia. Georgia has it's pretty clear, a pro-Kremlin government in power. They recently canceled their accession talks with the European Union after they held parliamentary elections that were not seen as being free and fair. There were irregularities. The European Parliament refused to accept them as legitimate, and they actually have a presidential election today. It's not actually a public election. It's been done through the parliament, from what I understand. So, and Georgian Dream basically had the only candidate involved. So it seems like there is going to be a big political crisis in Georgia. There have been street protests for, at this point, a couple of weeks in Tbilisi, the capital, and other cities in Georgia. It is very reminiscent of the situation that Ukraine faced in 2013, early 2014, when the pro-Russian president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, who subsequently fled to Russia, he refused to sign an association agreement between the EU and Ukraine. And that was actually something he'd even campaigned on signing, and then he suddenly flipped and wanted to bring Ukraine back into Russia's orbit, and that led to a revolution. It's known as the Euromaidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. And subsequently, Russia invaded Ukraine. They first invaded Crimea, and then the Donbass region in the east. And obviously in 2022, they invaded even more of Ukraine and tried to seize the capital, Kyiv. So it'll be very interesting to see if Russia loses even more influence now in Georgia. If there is a revolution, overthrow of the government, what would Russia actually do? Would they intervene militarily like they did in Ukraine? Would they be willing to pull the resources out of Ukraine? They were not willing to do that to prop up the Assad regime, but maybe they would see Georgia as more important. Or will they succeed and create a situation like with Belarus, where they are basically been drawn more and more into the Russian sphere of influence? In fact, they even allowed Russian troops to cross their territory and attack Ukraine in February and March 2022 when the Russian forces tried to seize Kiev. So, going to be very interesting times. There's just a few examples that I'm going to give you today about how we can judge Russia's ability to project its power outside its borders. What has happened in Syria is a humiliation for Vladimir Putin and Russia. It shows that they are not some super strong global superpower. In fact, they are now retreating back towards their own borders. The extent of that will be unveiled in the short and medium term, and their ability to continue the Russo-Ukrainian war at this intensity is starting to wane. They have three big problems, as I've pointed out in other videos, to solve in 2025. They are manpower, money, and materiel. They are running out of voluntary soldiers. They may have to go to mobilization or get soldiers from other countries like North Korea. Money, their economy is in dire straits. The ruble has been very shaky in the last few weeks. They have increasing inflation. They have very high interest rates. I think they're up to 21%, probably going to go to 24% very soon. And they have looming crises in their real estate, local real estate markets, their just general private economy, because so much of the economy is now focused on the military. So basically you've got what's known as military Keynesianism, which is the Russian government pumping in money for the war effort, but that's gobbling up basically most of their capacity. And they risk maybe having stagflation in the future because they've already have economic problems with their growth. They have very high inflation. They do have almost full employment at the moment because basically they have so many men who've signed up for the military or are working in the military industrial complex or have fled abroad. Most importantly, a lot of the very more dynamic and talented Russians, they left in the autumn of 2022 because they were scared of getting mobilized. So they are going to have, they don't have stagflation now, but that can flip very, very quickly, that they end up in a situation where the rest of the economy starts to collapse. They also have rising bankruptcies and companies paying later and later on their debt. So it's all set up for a lot of problems. And obviously then the materiel, Russia has been using up its Soviet era stock at an alarming rate if you're a Russian military planner, and they're burning through that. And if they keep going in 2025, they would probably burn through most of it. And then they'd have another issue where they'd have to build or buy in a lot of new military equipment in order to continue the war at this intensity. So those are the kind of broad strokes of what is happening with Russia's power projection, how it affects the Russo-Ukrainian war. The more and more influence that Russia loses abroad, the more retrenchment they have, the more they have to retreat into themselves. We are looking increasingly more likely to see a situation that we've seen in Syria, maybe even affecting Russia itself, a la Prigozhin mutiny that was unsuccessful, but it will be as sudden and as unpredictable when it finally happens in Russia going forward. So I'm going to leave it at that for today's video, and see you in the next one. Do побачення.